So I'm here on my fourth visit to South Sudan as UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And my last visit was relatively recent in December 21. But this visit, of course, has been accelerated, if you wish, by the situation at the northern borders of the country, the borders with Sudan, where we are witnessing a very large influx of people. In majority, South Sudanese refugees who used to be hosted in Sudan, but because of the fighting, they're now returning precipitously, if you wish, to their own country. And in a way, their conditions are similar to those of refugees, but they are actually returnees. And then, of course, amidst them, you also witnessed the arrival of thousands of Sudanese refugees and a few third country nationals, all of them fleeing conflict in Sudan. So my first message is really an appeal to the military leaders that are waging that conflict in Sudan. And my voice is not a political voice, it's a humanitarian one, but I think I have the responsibility on behalf of all the people who are fleeing. And remember, those that arrive here are only, in fact, a minority of all those that have been displaced inside Sudan and continue to be displaced, seeking safety. So my voice on their behalf, my message on their behalf is a message to the leaders: please stop this fighting. Yesterday I had very good discussion with President Salva Kiir on the need for, first and foremost, a ceasefire whilst negotiations go on, so at least the pressure on civilians, which is really enormous at the moment in Khartoum, in Darfur, in places of Kordofan and other parts of Sudan, this pressure ceases, and whilst the complex political negotiations continue. Meanwhile, of course, we need to continue to help the people on the move and the countries hosting them, such as South Sudan, and that's why I came here. I was in Awel on Sunday. I spent the day there with Marie-Hélène, our representative here in South Sudan, with the Commissioner of the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, with the Governor of Northern Bahr el Ghazal and other authorities. And I want to, first of all, thank the people of South Sudan for being so generous in hosting people from other countries fleeing, just like South Sudanese refugees have fled in the past from South Sudan and have been hosted by other countries. You see how important it is that borders remain open for people that flee war and that hospitality remains strong among host community. Of course, UNHCR and many other humanitarian partners are engaged in a very massive humanitarian operation to help the people fleeing, but to help also the communities hosting them. I was very impressed that in Awel, the representatives of the local community, of the South Sudanese community, told me that they had agreed with the authorities to give a rather large plot of land to the new arrivals, so that over there they are mostly Sudanese, so that they can quickly move from being supported by humanitarian assistance, by food rations, to being more self-reliant. And this is a very good move, I think, not only very generous, but also very forward-looking and needs to be supported internationally. We've had important discussions on the humanitarian response with President Salva, with the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Humanitarian Affairs, and other dignitaries. It is important. The government of South Sudan has pledged itself I think $15 million to help with a very important aspect of the response, which is the transportation of people, especially in rank, from the border to areas where assistance can be organized. In the case of rank, it will be, as you know, Malakal. And that's complicated because the only way to transport people is along the river. So the government has pledged support I hope that pledge of support can be implemented as soon as possible. Meanwhile, I assure the government that I continue to work with the international community to seek the necessary resources. We have received funding, but it is not enough. And we are operating in the context of a humanitarian appeal, of a refugee appeal that we issued at the beginning of the crisis, just after the Sudanese refugees started moving out of Sudan, back in April, if you remember. At that time, we appealed for about $500 million US, not just for South Sudan. This is for the whole region, so for Chad, Egypt, and other countries receiving South Sudanese refugees. That appeal was valid until September. But we have received about half, a bit less than half of that funding, about 40% of that funding. Unfortunately, now we have come to the end of that, and I have today to announce that we are now appealing for double that figure, for $1 billion from the beginning till the end of December, because now we are already in September, so we have to extend the program, the emergency program, in all these countries until the end of September, and of December, and we are appealing now for $1 billion. This is a very important message that you please have to help us convey to the international community. Again, this is an amount of, this is funding that is not only for South Sudan, but it is also for other countries that are receiving Sudanese refugees. In that billion, the amount of money we're appealing for South Sudan is $356 million. Now, I was asked to make it very clear. This is not money that is there on the table. This is money that needs to be mobilized. So this is an appeal, not a pledge of money. So we need to get it from states, from other sources, and we will work very hard. My visit here, I'm going to Chad next week. Same message will be to really have this funding mobilized as soon as possible. And for the government of South Sudan to implement its own pledges and to contribute to this response. I want to say one important thing in addition to this. For a few years now, I've been coming to this country to discuss with the government how best to create conditions for South Sudanese refugees, those that are outside the country, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, and in fact in Sudan, many of them. How can we create conditions for these refugees to come back? The government, after independence and after the troubles of 2016, 2017, said very clearly people should come back. But it's not enough to say people should come back. The government knows that conditions have to be created. Yesterday, President Salva said it very clearly. People will come back if there is security, if they feel secure, and of course, if there is also international support for this program of return. So this is another aspect. You may think that it is in contradiction. On the one hand, you have an emergency. On the other hand, we are talking about a solution. But in reality, the two programs are overlapping, because remember, the emergency is mostly about returnees, is mostly about South Sudanese coming back. So we need to accelerate all the plans that we have made to welcome South Sudanese people back, because now they're coming in very large numbers because of the circumstances in Sudan, but they're coming, they're here. They need support. They need to get back to their villages, to their towns, or to places of their choice. They need to make sure that their houses are not occupied by other people, that property issues are resolved. They need to be able to send their kids to school. They need to be able to access proper health facilities if they are sick. When President Salva spoke about security, I interpret this in a very large meaning. It's security, physical security, security from fighting, from violence, and that's very important. That's a big government responsibility. But it is also human security, education, health, employment are all parts of the security of a person. So this is what the returnees will look for. May I say, this is what all South Sudanese are looking for. And I said today at a symposium which we just attended, speaking together with the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, I said, in a way, this crisis is terrible, is an additional challenge in addition to everything else that South Sudan has to face. The consequences of conflict, climate change, economic issues, social issues, ethnic issues. In addition, now there is the impact of the nearby conflict in Sudan. But maybe this is an opportunity to really strengthen the commitment of the South Sudanese government towards its sole citizens. You know, the social contract that always must bind a government with its people, and this is an opportunity to strengthen it and to show that the government is serving its own people, in this case the returnees, but of course all the other communities as well. The government has developed a strategy for this. They call it durable solution strategy. I was assured by the government that within a few days the cabinet will adopt this strategy. This is very important because we then need to get support, international support, and it's important that the government is in the lead of that. So I hope that this will happen in the next few days. This is what I wanted to share with you. This is the reason of my visit. At the moment, as of yesterday, sorry, not today, as of yesterday, the figure of people who have fled Sudan is 963,000. So we're nearing 1 million. But of course, we have to plan for a little more because the planning figure, the figure that I mentioned, $1 billion, is until the end of the year. So 960, let's say 1 million is the people that have fled up to now. So between now and the end of the year, there will be more. So we have to project that. I can give you in a moment the planning figure until the end of the year for the whole appeal, not just for South Sudan. Yeah, maybe you can look for it and I'll give it to you in one moment, the planning figure. But up to now, you can say, to be simple, almost 1 million people have fled the country. It's a lot. This includes mostly Sudanese nationals, but also here in South Sudan, about 200,000 South Sudanese returnees who lived in Sudan before. So out of the million, let's say 1/5 is South Sudanese returnees who have come to South Sudan. So this is so the planning figure that we are using. It's I say 1 million people up to now, 1.8 million overall until the end of the year. I hope I'm not confusing you with all these figures. 1 million people that have left Sudan up to now, fled Sudan up to now, 1.8 million, the people that we project might leave between now by the end of the year, and that's the population for whom we need $1 billion. You see, when you start making the calculation, 1 billion sounds like a lot of money, but we're talking almost of 2 million people. So it's not that huge amount of money that we're talking about. And remember, I should have said that in some parts of this region, operations are very costly. In Sudan, in South Sudan, because of the logistics, the lack of roads, the remoteness of certain places. In Chad, same situation. And as I said, I'll be there next week. So these are very complex operations that cost a lot of money. I want to add one thing since you triggered this. Remember, like I said, this is only one part of the displaced population, those that are getting out of the country. You have a lot of Sudanese people and South Sudanese refugees in Sudan that are displaced inside the country. We don't really have firm figures because we can't be everywhere to count them like we are here or in Chad. But we're talking about, I would say, between 2 and 3 million people that have been displaced internally in Sudan as a result of the conflict. So you see, where we are talking about altogether maybe up to 4 million people affected that are fleeing the conflict, either inside or outside. It's a very, very big figure we're talking about. There is, in all this, there is an additional small aspects that you have touched upon. We have observed, yes, I don't have the exact figure, but we have observed a few thousand South Sudanese refugees in Ethiopia. This has nothing to do with the situation in Sudan, also coming. This is due to some issues in Ethiopia. You know that in Ethiopia, the US government had to suspend, I think this was public knowledge, had to suspend food assistance in the whole country because of some corruption findings. They are fixing that together with the Ethiopian government, but this has provoked a suspension of food aid, including in South Sudanese refugee camps. And this is why some people pressed by that had to take refuge. I don't know how durable that phenomenon will be, but it is something that, you know, it's an additional problem that we have to deal with at the moment. It's a little bit excessive to say that food is not there. WFP in most places, the World Food Program, they distribute food to refugees. In most places, because of lack of funding, that is true, has had to distribute only 50% of the ration. But when I was in Awel the other day, we went to visit the refugee settlement there, and WFP together with me announced that they were raising it. They got a little bit extra funding. They were raising it to 70%. So it's not perfect yet, but it is an improvement. And I think that basic services are being put in place, water, sanitation. I have to say, I only saw that one settlement in Awil, but I found that actually, considering that all this started in May, basically, we are in August, so it's 3 months, quite a lot of work has been done by the humanitarian organizations. And I fully appreciate the impatience of the refugees. Many of these people are also urban refugees. They're not used to those living conditions. So for them, the shock, the trauma is very, very high. And we need to accelerate. That was, we agreed. All these processes, registration, distributions, basic services with the help of the government. But I told the refugees, please be a little bit patient. It takes time to step up very quickly under such difficult logistical circumstances and with only 30% of the money that we need, basically. So, you know, it's not easy. A lot in the beginning was devoted to negotiating where they stay, setting up structures for that, warehousing. You know, a humanitarian operation needs a lot of infrastructure to be able to. We have ways to do it quickly, but it is always not as quick as people need. But we are on the right track, I think. And if this billion, this appeal that I have just spoken about, gets a good response from donors, we can go faster. And we hope the government of South Sudan will also cooperate, especially on the transport side, because this is where they can be very helpful. You are absolutely right. There are many crises around the world, not just Ukraine and Afghanistan, but look at the Sahel now. You know, even here in Africa, there are many crises, Eastern Congo, and many other places that cry out for help. Drought in the Horn of Africa, still the consequences of conflict in Ethiopia. I can give you a list that, you know, will still be here tonight if I give you all the list of the competing priorities. So it's very tough. You know, my message to the donor community is, please, dig deeper. I know there is fatigue, but what am I to? I cannot say to people suffering like the ones you mentioned that are hungry or do not have sanitation. Can I tell them that the international community is tired to help them? I cannot do that. I think the international community wants more solutions, wants to see the end of the tunnel. That is understandable. But meanwhile, I tell them, what do we do with all the people that have nothing to do with this conflict? They are victims of they are the main victims of the conflict. They need help. So we have seen, I always say this, we have seen during the COVID time that the international community, when there is a global challenge for everybody, can rise to the occasion and find the resources to fight against the challenge. So I think that the humanitarian, in a world with so many emergencies, it is important that there is more funding allocated to humanitarian assistance. But also, and this is the other important answer to your question, we need to look at development. You know, humanitarian is short term, can help feed a person for 1 month or give a temporary shelter. But you need to think of the long term. Are these people going to go back anytime soon? Well, some of them are South Sudanese, so they might just stay here. And even for the Sudanese, I am not optimistic that people will go back anytime soon. Some of the kids I met the other day, students, they told me, I told them, but if there is peace, if there is an agreement between the generals, will you go back? And they said, well, what do we go back to? Everything has been destroyed. So, it takes a long time before this is reconstructed. So I think that we need to think the medium term as well, at least. Maybe the long term is too difficult, the medium term. And this is where we need money to make the things sustainable. The government, I give you an example. The government of South Sudan made a good decision with the agreement of the local communities. As I said, we give you a plot of land, not just a tent, and then you stay there to wait for assistance. A plot of land where they can grow some food, and they will be given, kids will go to the local schools, they can have access to clinics. So this is a sustainable model, if you wish, more than humanitarian assistance, but it requires also international help. South Sudan alone cannot sustain the burden of this. And that's where development organizations, and development organizations means the World Bank, means the African Development Bank, means the big bilateral organization like USAID, like DFID. They are all very engaged in this discussion. I want that type of resource to be mobilized to complement humanitarian, because otherwise to get to that billion will be very tough. But if we combine different sources of funding, different ways, look at sustainability, I think we have a chance to try to help the people in the best possible way, which is really the whole purpose. But it is going to be tough, tough, tough. We see it everywhere. So many humanitarian programs are underfunded at the moment. And I think that this is not acceptable. I don't accept this. I don't accept fatigue. I think that we need to tell everybody that these are the responsibility of the whole world. And like there was a good response for COVID, at least in some aspects, I think there should be a good response also to humanitarian crisis. You have arrived a bit late, but can maybe the same questions not be asked again? Otherwise, we can go on, because some of these things have already been tackled. But let me very quickly, and I take advantage to find, I didn't complete the response to you, in fact. What prompted me is the crisis in Sudan, the influx of refugees and returnees into South Sudan, and the urgency of implementing a reintegration strategy, in particular for returnees in this country. I wanted to say, because you asked this important question, what are the main priorities? And we would say that the main priorities are food aid, because people need to eat, basic services, and by basic services I mean primary health care, sanitation and water, I would say, and a place to stay. This is really a shelter or a tent or hut or whichever other form of shelter. And then, of course, transport, logistical costs, because especially for those that arrive at the border and have to be further transported to other places. This is a big South Sudan issue because of the challenges that you have with the road system here. Some of it has to be done by boat, as we said earlier, so that's quite costly. So these are the big priorities, humanitarian priorities at the moment. There was also a question related to WFP. Maybe I'll ask Marie-Hélène to take that up.
Just very quickly, the basic needs are also the challenges. Transportation, as you know, out of rank is very difficult. And it is really the only way. And if we don't have transport, people are piling up in one transit center in rank that really should not be taking more than 3,000 people, and that routinely is having 6,000, 7,000. So there is an extension of the transit center being done, but you have to imagine that every single day, leaving rank for Malakal, there's about 1,000, 2,000 people on barges. If that stops, you can see how quickly that will become very, very challenging. WFP has been giving has been trying to give some cash vouchers for food in rank. That is correct. The basic need of the returnees, I think, again and again and again, what we have seen is that they are coming from Sudan. Obviously, as the conflict goes on in Sudan, they are more malnourished. They're also coming in, some of them are sick. So the longer the conflict goes on in Sudan, the more the needs they have when they arrive for food and for health services is high. I just want to go back to one thing that I think is important on registration. The government of South Sudan has now decided, first of all, the government of South Sudan has agreed that any Sudanese that comes here that needs asylum will be given refugee status. There's just no other process than just saying, I need protection, and they are given the status. What takes longer is the more detailed registration. The government of South Sudan has now decided that Sudanese refugee who needs assistance, who want to stay in camps because they're not able to work in South Sudan, etc., will be registered in only 3 places. These places are Wedwil in northern Bahr Ghazal. They are the existing refugee camps in the Ruang administrative area, Jamjang, and they are the camps in Maban in Upper Nile. So these are the 3 registration places for Sudanese refugees who require assistance. At the beginning, when they arrived in Juba, Gorom was used, but Gorom is not intended as a long-term place for Sudanese refugees.
First of all, we don't comment on individual cases. These are confidential processes, and therefore we're not going to give details publicly about an individual case, either of refugees or statelessness. But let me tell you, and Marie-Hélène can complete what I say. First of all, the government of South Sudan committed already 4 years ago to sign the international conventions, there are 2, to address and reduce and eliminate statelessness, meaning to give citizenship to people that have no citizenship and are on this territory if the legal conditions allow that to happen. That signature, which would engage the government to address this problem, those signatures have not yet happened. But today, at the symposium that we've just come from, we heard again that it is being discussed, because it has to be discussed in Parliament. This is an international treaty, so it has to be discussed in Parliament, approved, and then the government implements the signatures, and then it has to be implemented in national legislation. So we're still a little bit far behind, but the government has reiterated today its commitment to address the issue of statelessness. The responsibility is not UNHCR, it's the government. The government has to give nationality to people that qualify for that, of course, for whatever reasons, and that are present on the territory. And this includes the case that you have mentioned, which we are following. Like other cases individually, we're following each case that is brought to our attention. But it would be very useful if the government made those, I'm sure they will do it in the end, subscribe, ratify those conventions, so that then that allows the government to have the legislative, the practical tools to give nationality to people that are deprived of nationality. This seems quite simple. You have no passport. It's not simple. These are complicated legal process, often involving other countries as well. So we are helping always in each case to try to solve it, but it takes sometimes a little longer than we would like.
So the number of those arriving, we had a peak in the first 2 months. It went up to 3,000, 3,500 a day arriving in Rank. At the moment, we're at about between 1,000, 1,500 arriving, and this is mostly 90% it's South Sudanese. In the transit center, it really fluctuates. I think we're at an average about 6,000 in the transit center. But of course, there are plenty more who are not in the transit center. They're actually in the city in Rank, in various other places in Rank. Difficult to estimate exactly. There are up to 25,000 who are in Rank, and they've actually decided they don't want to move from Rank. Either they've got families there, or they don't want to move from Rank because they prefer to wait in Rank and see what happens on the other side. And they're actually pretty self-reliant already, so we're not really, doing a lot with them because they have found a way of living in Rank. 6,000 in the transit center is the norm. Again, if you think about it, considering there's about 2,000 a day moving down to Malakal, the minute this stops, you can imagine it's 1,500 arriving, and it will very quickly overwhelm the capacity. Now, the good news is that the local authorities have given land to extend the transit center, and the work on that extension has begun. And, well, again, if we get the resources, the extension could take up to 30,000 people, which would give us a lot more space, clearly, to receive people.